Okay, good evening, brothers and sisters. Welcome to day 7 of online retreat with Patrick Carney. And the topic for tonight, Dharma talk, is dependent arising. Brother Patrick, you may start your talk. Thank you.
Tonight we're looking at dependent arising. We're going to have two talks on this. First one tonight, second one tomorrow night. And this one, we're going to look at general principles. And then tomorrow night, we'll focus on how to apply it in the meditation practice. Because Satipatthana, and in particular, practicing Satipatthana for insight, for understanding, for awakening, is all about applying dependent arising. So this is the basic framework that we're working with. So let's start with the Indian Sanskrit word dharma, also known an English word, in Pali Dhamma. Dhamma has different layers of meaning, and one meaning for the Dhamma is the teaching, the Buddha's teaching. So we have the Buddha's Dhamma, his teaching. And the key to understand it, to get into it and really know what he's talking about, is that Dhamma is a first-person discourse, which we've mentioned, we've talked about this before. So we could contrast it with science, which is a third-person discourse. Now, in our culture, the standard for knowledge is science. And sometimes if people want to make Buddha Dhamma kind of respectable and fashionable, they'll say, well, it's really science. It's the science of the mind or something. Personally, I don't think it's science at all. And it's best not to confuse these two things. But for me, science is concerned with the world as objectively understood and publicly understood. In other words, the world when separated from our subjective perspective on it. So the world that everybody agrees, this is what's going on. While Dhamma is concerned with our experience of the world, and the emphasis is on experience. So what the Buddha teaches and what he's concerned with and what he's interested in is the nature of human experience from the perspective of being inside that experience. That's what he's interested in. And he explains this in a brief discourse called Sabbha Sutta, everything, where he begins by explaining to his students that he will teach them everything. And he says, what is everything? Eye sensitivity and forms, ear sensitivity and sounds, nose sensitivity and smells, tongue sensitivity and tastes, body sensitivity and tangibles, mind sensitivity and phenomena. Whoever would say, rejecting this everything, I shall declare another, if questioned on the foundation of his words, he could not explain and would become distressed. Why? Because it is beyond range. So that's the whole discourse. And it's interesting that it's a very short discourse, yet it covers everything. And it covers everything because it covers the 6 sensitivities that we've been talking about before. All experience comes to us through these sensitivities. And as we've said, we've got 6 of them, 5 of them are physical. And each of the 5 physical senses has its own unique stream of data. So the eye is sensitive to light, the ear is sensitive to sound, and so on. The mind has its own unique stream of data, such as thoughts, feelings, perceptions, concepts, and so on. But it also draws in the data from the 5 physical senses, and it brings all of these streams together, and from it, it creates a world, a unified world. So the sense that I have that I'm here in my world is a product of the 6 sensitivities, especially the 6th, the mind. So what our world is what can be received through these sensitivities. If there's anything out there that our particular sensitivities cannot pick up, then for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist for us. So the Buddha isn't saying that nothing exists apart from what we sense, but he's just saying for practical purposes, that this is all we've got. Anything else, he says, is beyond range. In other words, beyond range of our senses, beyond range of our experience. And he's just not interested in that. He's just interested in what we actually experience. Notice he says, whoever would say, rejecting this everything, I shall declare another. In other words, there's something beyond experience. If questioned on the foundation of his words, he could not explain and would become distressed. And this reminds us that when the Buddha is talking to people who have firm beliefs, he often would ask them, well, what's the experience which is the basis of this belief? And if the person can't produce an experience, then the Buddha's just not interested. So, okay, it's an idea you have and you're clinging to it. Well, good luck. So for the Buddha, the only thing we have, the only thing we can ever have is our experience. That's it. And if that's the case, then it follows that it is extremely important that we learn to clarify the nature of our experience. What is really going on? And this project of clarifying experience is what he calls satipatthana, or mindfulness meditation. And so this is the project that we're engaged in. So this is the Dharma, or the Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching. This is what it's about. Now you notice that in that discourse, the Buddha is going through the 6 sensitivities, the sensitivity and what the sensitivity is sensitive to, the object. So eye sensitivity and forms, ear sensitivity and sounds, etc. When he gets to mind sensitivity, he says the object is phenomena. That's the English translation. And what the word originally is dhammas. So it's the same word, dhamma, but here in the plural, there's lots of them. And here, Dhamma isn't teaching. Dhamma is what appears to us when we experience. In other words, if I experience something. Something appears in one or more of the 6 senses. That appearance is a Dhamma. So these are, in English, these are phenomena. This is the technical term, which means the appearances of things, or things as appearances. So for example, remember when we're doing tracking the thought stream, and we did the exercise, how do thoughts appear? Now, here we're treating thoughts as Dhammas. And you notice the question is not, what are thoughts? The question is, how do thoughts appear? So you notice, first of all, it's a practical question. It's not theoretical. So if I ask the question, what are thoughts? Then we could get into philosophical and psychological discussions about this and that and blah, 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 blah. But the question is not what are they, but how do they appear? But for the Buddha to say it appears as something is effectively the same saying it is that something, because that's all we've got. We've got how things appear in experience. That's the only thing there is. So this view of the world as dhammas, as phenomena, is very important in terms of understanding where the Buddha is coming from. So let's take a practical example. I don't think it's practical, but it's an example. Let's take something very philosophically esoteric, like a glass of water. So I'll put it on the table, I'll move the camera. So I've got a table, I've got a glass of water. What is this? Well, it's a glass of water, pretty obviously. Now, for starters, this thing can be studied. It can be measured. It can be weighed. It can be analysed, and it's something which exists independently of me. So, if I finish this talk and I can walk away from this table, and this glass of water still exists, it's still here. It's independent of me. It doesn't need me to exist. It's just here. So that's the world as objectively understood. So that's the world of science. But what about the world of dhammas, of phenomena? What is this? Well, I'll show you. That's what it is. Do you see the difference? So feeling thirsty is a dhamma. Thinking is a dhamma. Looking is a dhamma. Reaching is a dhamma. Touching is a dhamma. Lifting is a dhamma. Heaviness is a dhamma. Bringing is a dhamma. Tilting is a dhamma. Wetness is a dhamma. Swallowing is a dhamma. Satisfaction is a dhamma. Placing is a dhamma. Hearing is a dhamma. Releasing is a dhamma. There's a whole series of dhammas, of phenomena, of appearances, of aspects of experience. And for the Buddha, that's what this is. So it's a different way of looking at the world and experiencing the world. And each of these dhammas is an experienced event. And it comes and goes within a stream of awareness. And when I walk away from this desk, this glass of water as a dhamma disappears because I can't see it. And it reappears, it arises when I come back. So this glass of water is inherently or radically impermanent. It's impermanent not in the objective sense that, okay, this glass is, we bought it last year, maybe, and it's going well. It's pretty tough. It will last a few years, but then eventually it'll break. When the Buddha says this glass is impermanent, that's not really what he's talking about. He's saying it's radically impermanent because as soon as I turn away from it, it ceases. I come back, it arises. Do you see the difference? It's radically impermanent and it's contingent. It's dependent upon conditions. So this is the world of dependent arising. In Pali, this is paticca samuppada, and it's the fundamental theoretical framework that underlies the Buddha's view of the world and his teaching. So dependent arising is all about the underlying fabric of things, the underlying patterns of things when they are experienced. So it's a systems view, what today would be called a systems view of reality. And each individual experience that we have, that we undergo, is one part of an almost infinitely complex system made up of a vast number of other events that are intimately related to each other. And these relationships are normative. Like we have in the West, we have, in the modern world, we have the concept of the laws of nature. So this is the Buddha's equivalent. The Paticca Samuppada dependent arising represents the laws of nature. And it's all about relationships. And these relationships are normative. In other words, in practical terms, they are reliable. And they can be mapped and they can be understood. And it's this which makes our situation workable and liberation possible. So the Buddha at one point says, look, I teach two things. I teach dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. And he also teaches the idea of a path. So we have the human condition, dukkha, over here. I think you're all familiar with dukkha. Over here, we have the cessation of dukkha, enlightenment, nibbana, etc. In between, we have a path. The job is to get from here to there. But how do we do that? What makes this journey possible is dependent arising, because things happen according to patterns which we can understand. So if I can shift the relationships between things so that I have less dukkha, then I can move towards along that path. So the idea is we live in this infinite network of natural conditions, and our aim is to live in accordance with these conditions in such a way that dukkha, that suffering, comes to its end. And the way the Buddha talks about it is to abandon dhammas that lead to suffering, to cultivate dhammas that lead to the cessation of suffering. And this is possible through dependent arising. Now, if we're going to move along a path to a destination which we've mapped out, we need to be able to influence the flow of events. We need to shape our experience in some way. And this is what dependent arising makes possible. However, the problem is, which I'm sure you've all noticed in your meditation practice, is that this system of dependent arising is mapping a reality which is infinitely complex. It's so complex that it's actually impossible to control our experience, because what causes an experience to arise is influenced by so many conditions. It is impossible to control all of these conditions. There's just too many of them, apart from anything else. So an example which I'm sure you're all aware of, I'm meditating, I'm struggling in my practice, suddenly everything falls into place, all the ducks line up, and my meditation runs very smoothly. And I think I finally cracked it. Now I know how to do it. I come back, I sit down confidently for the next session, and everything is in chaos. And it's absolutely impossible for me to get back to what it was before. why can't I reproduce a past experience? Why is that impossible? Because that experience was conditioned by such a large number of conditions that I can't line them up. And especially since most of those conditions are absolutely unknown to me. They're invisible for all practical purposes. But these conditions suddenly came together to form a very specific pattern, and my mind-body system suddenly went doop, and shifted into a smooth, clear meditation session for as long as that pattern remained. Then suddenly the conditions, doop, they shifted again. This smoothness disappears and it's not coming back. And I cannot make it happen. It's impossible. So what can I do about it? So this brings us to the aspect of dependent arising called specific conditionality, or Iddha Paccayata in Pali. So we start with the general, with the big picture, dependent arising, which describes the patterns of our experienced world. And these patterns, these relationships, are stable and normative. They make up a natural order. Specific conditionality is that aspect of dependent arising that we find when we start to drill down into that natural order to find out what's really going on. So dependent arising describes the patterns. Dependent arising means that whatever we experience comes into existence because of phenomena other than itself, because of dhammas other than itself. And it goes out of existence because of dhammas other than itself. So every dhamma that we experience, every appearance, arises because of other dhammas. And when it ceases because of other dhammas. So it's a big picture. Specific conditionality takes this one step further. It says that among this infinitude of conditions, it's possible to pin down one where precisely this conditions precisely that. So it's mapping a specific trajectory among these dhammas. It's mapping a specific relationship. And change this, target this relationship, and that changes. It's impossible to control experience, but it is possible to influence it. Specific conditionality is expressed in a brief Pali verse that appears again and again in the suttas. And in Pali it's a verse, in English it's just a bit of English. And it goes, when this is, that is. Because this arises, that arises. When this is not, that is not. Because this ceases, that ceases. So if you understand that little, in Pali it's a verse, but not in English, that sentence, if you understand that sentence, you understand everything the Buddha is talking about. It's all in that sentence. When this is, that is. Because this arises, that arises. When this is not, that is not. Because this ceases, that ceases. So let's unpack this sentence. So it's in 2 lines, the way I've written it, typed it out. The opening of both lines conveys correlation rather than what we would normally call causation. So when this is, that is. When this is not, that is not. So this is correlation. It's saying that this accompanies that. When we find X, we will also find Y. They always turn up together. And when we cannot find X, we won't find Y. If one turned up to the party, the other one turned up to the party. If that one's not here, the other one's not here. So this is correlation. And in contemporary science, it's said that correlation is not causation. And if you practice science, I notice in the social sciences, in any event, they're very careful about that. But if you're looking for the cause of something, and where would you go looking? Well, the patterns of correlation give us somewhere to look. Let's give an example from meditation. Let's say that when I focus on my breathing, so I'm doing breathing as meditation object. I focus on my breathing with great determination, and I find that my shoulders get tight. When this is, that is. So I start to experiment by relaxing my effort, and then I discover that my shoulders relax. When this is not, that is not. So I'm seeing a pattern in my experience. And when we practice mindfulness, we study these patterns. And as we've seen, this involves both noting what's in the foreground, so directing awareness to something actively, but it also involves noticing what's in the background. So I'm focusing on one thing, but I'm noticing other things as well. And this allows patterns to emerge. Give you another example of correlation, and the way something closer to the way it would have been understood in the Buddhist time, because it comes out of a traditional understanding. Remember, the Buddha is way before the scientific era. I have a friend of mine in Brisbane who years ago, he used to hang out with the traditional owners of Stradbroke Island. Stradbroke Island is an island off the east coast of Australia, close to Brisbane. And the traditional owners are the descendants of the tribes or the clans that originally lived there. And my friend used to hang out with the men because the social life is divided into men's business, women's business. And he's hanging out with them one day. They're sitting around, and one of the young men says, "We should go fishing off the North Head tomorrow because the such and such fish will be biting." And my friend says, and everybody says, "That's a really good idea, let's do that." And my friend says, "How do you know? How do you know those fish are going to be biting off the North Head?" And the young man looks at him as if he's completely stupid and says, "Didn't you see that flock of whatever they were birds flying overhead? Some species or other?" And my friend, who actually hadn't noticed, after all, he's a white fella, he doesn't notice things, said, yeah, sure. And the young man said, "Well, this time of year, when those birds are flying overhead, those fish are biting off the North Head." This is dependent arising. This is specific conditionality. When this is, that is. And it's reliable. People will go out fishing on the basis of this pattern. But of course, it's not saying that the birds flying overhead cause the fish to be there. There's a lot more going on. But there is a pattern, and the pattern is stable. So it can be mapped, it can be used. This is dependent arising. This is specific conditionality. So that's the opening of the two lines. When this is, that is. When this is not, that is not. And then the conclusion of the two lines, because this arises, that arises. Because this ceases, that ceases. So here it's definitely causation rather than correlation that the Buddha is talking about. So you can definitely say this causes that. So again, it's a relationship. Now, why is causation and correlation important? Why is it so significant? Because we want to send our experience in a certain direction, along a certain path. We want body and mind to settle and become still, and therefore the mind to become clear. That's what we're doing in this meditation. So how do we do that? Well, we study the patterns of experience as we practice, and we notice the connections. What conditions stillness? What conditions agitation and restlessness? What conditions clarity? What conditions confusion and dullness? This is what we're studying. And notice that bad, quote unquote, meditations are just as useful for this project as good, quote unquote, meditations, because they too show us patterns. People often have this thing about, you mustn't judge your experience. There are no good meditations and no bad meditations, and so on. And why is that? Why is it so important? It's because what we're looking for is useful information from the meditation. And bad meditations can give us just as good information, sometimes even better than good meditations. So it's not that we're not judging, it's that the judging is a different kind of judging. Bad meditations show us what's getting in the way. What are the obstacles in our path? Once we clarify the obstacle, once we can know what it actually is, then we can understand what conditions it's arising and what conditions its cessation. And then, once we understand that, we can do something about them. And that's why I like to say that distractions are our teachers. Distractions are very, very important because they teach us about our mind and our body. So on the one hand, this dependent arising is so complex that we cannot control our experience. It's too infinitely complex for that. But there is always something we can do to influence our experience. Always something we can do to influence it. So, for example, we can decide to work with specific mental states. So the Buddha, for example, in the Eightfold Path, he has this samadhi section on mindfulness. And there are three factors that he lays out there as being significant. Samma vayama, samma sati, samma samadhi. So right effort or energy, right mindfulness, right concentration or integration. So he says, look, these are really important. And if you look at them, what is laid out is a pattern. So samma vayama, right effort, right energy, this is the active side of meditation. This is the do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it side. On the other end, you have samma samadhi, right? Concentration, integration, unification. This is the peaceful, receptive side of meditation. It doesn't do anything. So you have the active and the receptive, the doing and the being, as it were. And in the middle, you have mindfulness, which balances these two. So the Buddha says, you want to see what's influencing your experience, look at these things. Look at these patterns. Check out these. and check out the patterns. So we could just work with specific mental states, such as these. We could work with specific physical states, like, for example, posture. How to set up a posture. How long should I maintain the one posture? When should I change it? When should I move from stillness into movement, or from movement into stillness? And so on. So the method and the social structure, the retreat, gives us a framework that enables us to study the flow of experience and to discover the patterns that underlie it. And again, dependent arising describes a natural state of affairs, the natural order. This means there's always something we can do to shape our experience in particular ways and send our experience off in particular directions. And this is working with specific conditionality. So in the practice, we study the stream of our experiences. And the reason why we're doing this is we want to take our experience from normal human suffering toward a more flourishing life, what the Buddha calls enlightenment. To do that, we need to see and understand what phenomena, what dhammas, what experienced events condition the arising of our suffering and abandon them. And we need to see what phenomena, what dhammas condition the cessation of our suffering and cultivate those. And the Buddha sums this up in a very famous verse from the Dhammapada. It's Dhammapada 183. He says, not doing any wrong, cultivating the wholesome, purifying the heart, this is what Buddhas teach. Heart here is citta. This is one occasion when I would definitely translate citta as heart, because I think it fits. So not doing any wrong, cultivating the wholesome. Essentially, here the Buddha is using the term papa, wrong. Sometimes you see it translated as evil. It's probably like that in the Pali for purposes of rhythm. But essentially he's saying cultivate the kusala, the wholesome, abandon the unwholesome, the akusala. Kusala is a key technical term in the Buddha's ethics that has a cluster of meanings. In its broadest usage, kusala, or wholesome, indicates health. So let's look at what this implies. If we ask the question, is health a good thing? What would your response be? So let's say you meet a friend you haven't seen for some time, and your friend says, how are you? And you reply that you are in very good health. Would you be puzzled if your friend responded negatively by saying, well, so what? What's so good about that? You'd be puzzled. You think, what? What's wrong with it? Because it's obvious that health is good. We don't have to justify why health is good. It's just obvious that it's good. In other words, health is intrinsically good. It is good within itself. It doesn't need any justification beyond itself. This is kusala, wholesome, something which is healthy, good within itself, intrinsically good. Now, health also has an instrumental value. In other words, if I am healthy, I can do things that I cannot do if I am sick. I can accomplish things that otherwise I couldn't accomplish. So this brings us to the second meaning of kusala, which is skillful. And I think the translation of skillful, unskillful is probably more fashionable in the West these days than healthy, than wholesome and unwholesome. But in the more traditional Theravada, they stick with wholesome, unwholesome. This word kusala is actually associated with a particular kind of grass called kusha grass. This is a grass found certainly in North India. I don't know if it's found in South India, but it's got very sharp edges. And traditionally it's used to, you weave it into seats, into mats to sit on. And in particular, it's popular with yogis, with meditators, and so on, including the Buddha. He sat on kusha grass. Now, this grass is supposed to have healing properties. Its chi is very strong. And kusha actually means sharp, because the edges of this grass are very, very sharp. And this makes it very difficult to work, to cultivate, to harvest, and to make into useful items. So you have to be very skillful to handle this grass, to handle the kusha grass. So this is kusala, meaning skill. And it can indicate a mundane skill, like the skill of a good craftsman, or a dharma skill, like the skill of an experienced meditator. So kusala has two aspects. That which is kusala is good within itself, and it leads to a good result. So you notice where dependent arising fits in. We cultivate the wholesome to move along the path to awakening. We want to shape our experience in a certain way. So we want to understand what moves us in a skillful, what is skillful to move us in that direction. This is kusala. We want to understand what moves us in the opposite direction, that is akusala. And to do that, to figure all this out, we learn to read the patterns of our experience. This is the cognitive aspect, so that we can develop a taste for that which is intrinsically good. This is the heart aspect. We can learn to like it, to prefer it. And this is developing the skill that takes us along the path. And this is skill in understanding and applying dependent arising. So what we'll do tomorrow night is to look more closely at how this general principle of dependent arising can be applied to the meditation practice that we're doing. But I think that's enough for tonight.
Sadhu, 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 Brother Patrick, for another excellent Dhamma talk tonight. To our Facebook friends, and we hope to see you again tomorrow at 7:30. Good night.